Most founders think they have a growth problem, and sometimes they do. But honestly, a lot of the time, what they actually have is a misdiagnosed revenue problem. Before I go further, if this kind of thinking is interesting to you, subscribe. I'm going to be sharing more breakdowns like this because I think a lot of teams right now are operating with a diagnosis that's slightly off, and that quote unquote slightly off is what compounds over time. And the reason it's so hard to see is because it doesn't show up in a clean, obvious way anymore. It's not like traffic suddenly falls off a cliff or conversion just breaks overnight. It's more subtle than that. And because none of those things feel dramatic on their own, teams don't treat them as connected. So it turns into, we need more awareness. We need more traffic. We need more customers. And I get why that happens because each of those things feels directionally true. But underneath all of that, there's usually one thing going on. Revenue is leaking somewhere in the customer journey, just not where teams think to look first. Now, quick question before we get all into it. I'm curious what you're seeing. Is growth feeling harder for you right now? Drop a yes or a no in the comments. Because one of the biggest mistakes I see when growth feels harder is that teams jump straight into fixing mode before they've actually figured out whether something has really changed or if it just feels like noise. So the first thing I always look at is actually pretty simple, and I don't try to overcomplicate it at the start. I'm just asking one question. Where does growth first start to feel different? And a quick way to decide where to start, because otherwise everything feels equally important, is this. I always start closest to the customer first. I don't start with paid or channels or spend. I start with behavior. And you can usually feel it in the things you already look at every week. You open Shopify or your revenue dashboard, and revenue is still coming in, but it feels like more effort than before. You look at new customers and they're still coming in, but something about how they behave feels slightly different than it used to. You look at repeat purchases and realize people are still buying, just not as predictably or as quickly as before. Or you look at paid and think, why is it getting more expensive to get the same outcome? And none of those things look like failure on their own. That's the important part. They just feel slightly off. And I usually find that whatever feels slightly off, quote unquote, closest to the customer first is where the story starts, because that's usually the first place behavior actually changed. Next thing I do is something most people skip. I compare what should be happening with what is actually happening. And the quickest way to know what quote unquote should be happening actually is not some complicated benchmark. It's your memory of what it used to feel normal in the business, what a healthy month used to feel like, what performance used to look like when things were working. That becomes your baseline. And then you ask, does the story still make sense? Because usually the signal isn't one giant metric collapsing. It's contradictions starting to show up across the business, like revenue is holding, but growth feels harder. Or engagement is strong, but conversion isn't following the same way. Or acquisition still looks healthy, but profitability starts tightening underneath it. That's usually the moment I pay attention. Because when the same effort stops producing the same business outcome, something underneath the system has shifted. And then this is usually where the real clarity shows up, because now I'm asking a different question. When did customer behavior first stop repeating the way it used to? Not where revenue dropped, earlier than that. The first moment something became less predictable. Maybe customers used to naturally come back for a second purchase within a certain window, and now that timing starts stretching out. Or launches used to create a repeat engagement for weeks, and now momentum fades much faster after the first purchase. Or new customers used to behave similarly quarter after quarter, and now newer cohorts look noticeably weaker than older ones. And none of those shifts feel dramatic in the moment. That's why they get missed, because nothing looks broken. The pattern just quietly stops repeating the same way it used to. And that first break in consistency is usually where the leak actually begins. And once you see that, the last step is simple. You name it correctly, not in fancy language, just in plain terms. This is a mix issue. This is a frequency issue. This is a second purchase issue. This is a journey issue. And once you can say it clearly, everything else gets easier, because now you're not reacting to noise. You're fixing the point where behavior actually changed. So if this feels familiar, like something you've seen but couldn't quite explain, I go deeper into this in the full session.